Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to A Black History of Electronic Dance Music, the lecture series at Harvard University. This lecture series, sponsored and presented by the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative, is an adjunct to the class AFRA-AMER 146X, offered by the Department of African and African American Studies and cross-listed in the Department of History at Harvard University. The mission of this lecture series is to highlight the signal contributions of Black people to the creation of the increasingly popular genre of electronic dance music. Mentioning electronic dance music elicits questions over origins and boundaries, especially following a record-breaking world tour that has introduced the genre's form to a new generation of listeners. While oft-forgotten, Black, queer, femme, and non-binary people invented the modern-day genre's arrangement, composition, production, and distribution. They have and continue to undergird distressed community sonic landscapes, enlivening social movements and seeding multi-billion-dollar markets. From disco to house to techno, each seminar crisscrosses wide-ranging geographies, including Chicago, Detroit, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, New Orleans, Berlin, London, and Manchester, United Kingdom. In our class, we ask how disco, house, and techno empowered marginalized groups in these cities to cope with the organized abandonment of urban infrastructure and public life in the 1980s and 1990s. We weed into thorny issues of cultural appropriation, musical ownership, and acknowledgement. So often, our study of local scenes connects with their global popularity. Why? And how did local music scenes take on global significance, and with what opportunities and consequences? In each class, we pair essential LPs, EPs, singles, and bootleg recordings with related texts in history, musicology, and theory to ask how Black electronic musicians responded to and shaped history's unfolding. Last week, our class studied New Orleans bounce, and this week our class focuses on London's and Manchester's dub, jungle, garage, progressive house, and two and dubstep genres, which flourished in the wake of blues underground shebeen clubs and reggae's makeshift sound system culture. Today, we are so pleased to welcome to campus Ryan Christopher Clarke, who hails from the river delta of New Orleans. His lecture, Techno as a Pedagogy of Suggestion, is a meditation on the natural parallels between geology and the suggestive, imaginative spaces that techno creates. Clarke delivers the second lecture for the first season of this brand new series. We are so pleased to learn from him today. Before we welcome Ryan C. Clarke to the stage, some business. We are pleased to host an in-person audience, and thanks to our great crew at Education Support Services, we have a global audience joining us via our YouTube live stream. Hello, everyone online. After Ryan C. Clarke's talk, we will facilitate a question and answer session. For those online, please submit questions using the chat function on YouTube. We will do our best to address them live. For those in person, we have an audience mic. Please raise your hand, and our fantastic research assistant, Ebony Smith, will get to you. We ask you to keep your question brief to allow others to participate. A recording of this talk will be available to view on our YouTube page, which you can access using this QR code. We have many more components of our lecture series that are soon to launch, including our website hosting these talks and other important announcements related to electronic dance music at Harvard. Please use this QR code to join our mailing list to keep up with future updates. Mark your calendars, too, for the lectures and performances that remain in our fall 2023 semester for Season 1. It's for a hybrid performance lecture entitled 1470s about the first gay club they visited in Dayton, Ohio, and how it's shaped their artistic practice. On November 28th, co-founder of Dweller Electronics and booking agency Discwoman, Frankie DeKaiser Hutchinson, will speak on creating Black ecosystems through the festival. Finally, on December 5th, author of Creating a Black Counterculture, a book about Detroit techno's history and global influence, will lecture on the book and spin a live performance of the LP Texodus. A live recording of our October 17th live stream of Abdu Mongo Ali's talk, Conjuring on the Dance Floor, The Poetics of Club Music, is now available to view on our YouTube channel. This is turning into a very exciting season of talks. We encourage you to stay updated via the mailing list. We are tremendously thankful to announce our newest co-sponsor, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. We are also grateful to our long-standing partners in the Mahindra Humanities Center, the Department of Music, the Standing Committee on Theater, Dance, and Media, the Department of Anthropology, and the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Studies. And now, for what we are all waiting for, today's speaker. We aim to have a student in Afro-Amber 146X introduce our esteemed guests. Today, Kayla Briette, a Massachusetts Institute of Technology graduate researcher in the MIT Media Lab and an artist in their own right, will introduce Ryan C. Clarke. Kayla Briette is a multidisciplinary artist, filmmaker, and composer, exploring themes of futurity and belonging. With work spanning film scores and documentary to virtual reality installations, she aims to amplify untold stories and write love letters to the diaspora communities she grew up in. Her film, Smoke That Travels, explores home and immerses viewers in her prairie band Potawatomi heritage. As a film composer, she aims to accent emotion on screen, including her scores for upstander projects Dear Georgina, a follow-up to the Emmy Award-winning Dawnland 2018, After Earth by Jess X. Snow, and Mino Bimad Deziwin by Ishkwaze Shane Mixabi, spanning stories of truth and reconciliation, queer environmental futures, and decolonial love. Kayla's work has been exhibited by MoMA Doc Fortnight, PBS, NYT, as in the New York Times, Smithsonian APAC, and her film has been archived by Smithsonian NMAI. Through live performances, she has shared stories at South by Southwest, Imagine Native, and collaborated with genre-breaking artists U4, MC Ting Budong, and Yaha Yehan in multiple venues across China as a Found Sound Music Diplomacy Fellow. Her VR installation, Trove, is a digital archive project exploring collective memory and our affective relationship to objects. Named a MacArthur Foundation meets Sundance New Frontier Fellow for Immersive Arts, as well as a 2022 Asian Cultural Council Fellow, she explored expressions of Afro-Asian and indigenous futurity across Sino-diaspora in Taiwan. Currently, Kayla is continuing her explorations in archival and memory as a graduate researcher and MAS candidate at the MIT Media Lab. With a playful and imaginative approach, she aims to illustrate multicultural perspectives through storytelling. Please warmly welcome Kayla to the stage.
Thank you. How's everybody feeling? Woo! I'm very pleased to introduce Ryan C. Clarke. A tonal geologist from the northern Gulf Coast, Ryan Christopher Clarke notices the passage of time as both a trained sedimentologist and artist researcher as co-editor at Dweller Electronics, a group dedicated towards providing Black counterpoint within an otherwise eurologically dominant music industry. His works have been included in Rhizome, Frieze Art Fair Los Angeles, Arena Annual, Terraforma Journal, Louisiana State University Digital Commons, Boiler Room Festival New York, and YesWeCannibal. He is a member of the American Geosciences Union, a co-recipient of the Allied Media Critical Minded Grant, and is studying ethnomusicology at the Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Knowing intimately the ways his home is at great risk of physical and cultural erasure, Clarke finds ways to not only document this loss quantitatively in scientific research, but qualitatively with works that try to articulate the shared knowledges his people have with the Mississippi Delta and its tributaries. Through the lenses of jazz, New Orleans bounce, Detroit techno, Chicago house, and the geologies underneath, he views the progression of technology and culture at large as a depositional process sourced by Black innovation under the theory Southern electronics. Please join me in welcoming Ryan C. Clarke.
Okay, cool. Thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Kayla, George, and everyone else, sound team. Thanks for the setup. So that was a lot of introduction, which I deeply appreciate. But because of the time, I really want to get to it. So I won't talk too much about myself. So we'll talk a little bit about the music. And I kind of wanted to start with a sort of prelude. I don't think I need this. I can use this. Maybe you'll need it. Okay. I'll start with an Anthony Braxton quote. Anthony Braxton is an avant-garde jazz saxophonist. He plays alto, amongst other things. In fact, he might consider himself more as an American musician or a creative musician. But in his liner notes for one of his records, this was noted, and I've kind of used this as a bit of a North Star, and maybe y'all can use this for where we might be headed. So we'll start the quote. I myself was into mathematics and philosophy, seeing music from a mathematical perspective and working with mathematical systems. I wanted to make up my own vocabulary because I didn't want to follow anybody else. I wanted to find my own avenues. My background, like Kayla spoke to earlier, is really connected to, no need, okay, cool. Is really connected to the sciences. I did 12 years in geology where I got a couple of degrees, and it wasn't up until around 2020 or lockdown, which was definitely a rupture point for all of us, that I recognized that I love music way too much and I wanted to spend more time than not thinking about it and writing about it, but at the same time I didn't want to completely bifurcate or run away from a lot of my teachings and the perspective that I gained during that education. So when I read this, I thought this was really important. So try to keep this in mind while I talk, because there's a bit of a weaving of knowledges or epistemologies. Again, like both George and Kayla spoke to, I am a co-editor in 1/3 of kind of the core unit of Dweller Electronics, which is a festival that takes place annually in Brooklyn, New York at the end of February, the last month of February. And it is a Black Techno festival that includes not just performances and, parties or raves, but also there's an educational programming which I lead the programming alongside the person who also took my picture, Sean D. Henry Smith. And I just wanted to share a little bit about Dweller, as well as some pictures that make me happy, and just so y'all can get an idea about what we're up to. So initially this came from Frankie Hutchinson, who will be here in a couple of weeks. But during her time curating and booking shows, she came to this understanding of Detroit techno, or techno in general, not necessarily being created and beginning on the other side of the Atlantic, such as Germany and London and those scenes which have really held on to that dance culture, but really began in the early 80s in Detroit and kind of the surrounding cities in the Midwest, and that really kind of lit a fire under her to kind of broadcast that culture and knowledge to other people. And as of now, we're on our 5th year of Dweller, and something that we really try to engage with and deeply believe in is this kind of intergenerational continuum that not just techno, not just Detroit techno, but really Black music and Black social music, you can call it dance music as well, and to try to make that connection explicit, make that continuum explicit. And so here you have contemporary DJs right now, such as Crystal Mess, who's at the top in the white. You have Juliana Huxtable, who's at the bottom right. And then on the top left, you have Stacy Hot Wax Hale, who was one of the first DJs, period, who did this thing called Sneaker Mix, which back in the 80s, Detroit was one of the first places that used 2 turntables. Just last week in the class, or just yesterday in the class, we saw how a lot of the UK sound system scene does did and does just use one turntable, but to have this kind of continuous mix happen in the basement of this one DJ called Ken Collier. And she was 14 when she went to this kind of basement party, and so when she got a residency at this one Detroit club called Cheeks, she kind of brought a lot of those knowledges back over. And so, not to give her space, but to extend a space to continue that and to not treat it like it's this buried, dead, preserved memory, but it's still here and it's still around, and so really grateful for that. And I just wanted to share some other pictures too. And in the middle here is Al Esther, another kind of OG in the Detroit scene. He does amazing choreography while he DJs, so if you ever get a chance to check him out, he's an amazing dancer. Before I go off of this, Dweller is also happening in February next year in 2024, so a little plug there, you should come check it out. But I really enjoyed the sort of syntax of this whole lecture series, where it's not a history of Black electronic dance music, but it's a Black history. And I feel like the ideas that center around Blackness and the ones that center around history are kind of antithetical to each other. I feel like Blackness tries to, handle itself in a way that is sometimes illegible for institutions or people that really want to kind of index and get a very clear objective sense. Just a couple days ago, George and I were talking about how jazz is sort of has such an illegible history. Sometimes it feels like there are multiple people almost like actively lying about what the origins of jazz are, who started jazz. The idea that you can even pinpoint a history to a single moment, a single person, a single event is foolish. And so I think not just calling a history, but a Black history is really important. So I am going to try to tiptoe up to the kind of moment of emergence from Techno, but what I really am going to avoid is to try to pinpoint it to a particular person, a particular group of people, because that's just a narrative, and shouts out to narratives, but this is very much an oral culture, and so as that game of telephone continues, something's going to get caught in the static. So I really want to start with the basis of just Black music as a West African tradition and its customs, which can kind of predicate culture itself. And so a early Black composer and a teacher, Ollie Wilson, who taught at, I think, either Oberlin, I believe. From 1990, he explained some of his conceptual approaches around sub-Saharan West African music and Black music. And we're going to get to a couple of these, but obviously all of them don't kind of make their way into techno. But again, we're going to tiptoe our way there. So the first one's rhythmic and just rhythmic contrast. And so you'll get a lot of syncopation, a kind of percussive dissonance, just a lot of action going on where it's not this kind of continuous beat. Again, you can think of like jazz drums, such as like Mac Roach or even Jay Dilla's drums, and how they're just a little bit early, a little bit quote unquote sloppy or imperfect. But within that, you have a fixed framework, and I think as free as people try to consider jazz music, it is a very kind of structured thing, but what happens in those structures are kaleidoscopic. And then to go back to Jay Dilla, he made a lot of beat music, and beat music in general does have a bit of a fixed framework. And then percussiveness in general, also percussiveness in the vocals, musical forms, mainly featuring call and response. That's not rooted in, as many people would say, in the plantation, but it's really rooted as a response to an environment and customs that were already coming over from West Africa. And so as you have the transatlantic slave trade from West Africa to the Caribbean to the American South and places like Virginia and South Carolina, these notions of how they, spent their time and got through labor, they just brought that into situations that, obviously didn't ask for. A tendency to fill up all the musical space and body motion being integral to music making, so you really can't just engage with music as sort of a head relationship, but one of body. And then it's to move is also to listen. But one of those main ones, I think it was number 3, no, it was number 2, was On Repetition, Black Culture by James Sneed. This came out in '88, I believe, and some of those were handed out. And I think there are a couple of notions that I highlighted that I wanted to get at so we can start to find a sort of Venn diagram in our arrival to techno, because it really isn't that much of a deviation of the sort of tradition that Black people had to do under, really sort of Southern imperialism that we call the planters and the plantation. And so once you have the Great Migration, you have people sort of amplifying the same kind of blues, rhythm and blues customs, but into machines instead of guitars. So back to African music, it normally emphasizes dynamic rhythm or organizing melody within juxtaposed lines of beats grouped into differing meters. That sounds very similar to the first list from Wilson. But this part about repetition, I think, is really, really important because it starts to deal with Black culture that has a foundation in nonlinearity, or something that we might understand as Euclidean. Think of a kind of X and Y axis flat, two-dimensional. And so how lines would work or behave in 2 dimensions would mean that the more you repeat a certain magnitude or vector, it will just continue to infinitely increase in one direction. Whereas in Black culture, there's more of a circulation, and so that would be something spherical or maybe something non-Euclidean. Non-Euclidean we don't learn too much about in geometry class, if you took geometry class, like in high school or something like that. That is much more Euclidean, so it's a little tough to wrap your head around, but we'll get to that later. But in general, the idea of repetition actually being something circulatory reminds me a lot of, again, going back to West Africa, Adinkra symbols, most notably Sankofa, which I wish I had a picture of. But generally, it's sort of like, it means to go back and go get it, and to move forward is also to look back, and to look back is to move forward. And so you get this kind of sense of circulation where you get a bit of an equilibrium as opposed to this kind of linear situation of accumulation and growth the more that you do. And we all see that in capitalism and in the Western world. Accumulation and growth is kind of what they know to do. So, and this is not putting a kind of connotation gesture on it. It's not positive in the way that progression is considered positive or regression is considered positive. As much as Black music tries to think about innovation, it's always looking back and trying to, not even trying to, but since to behave in its own culture and in its own history. I don't think a lot of us are trying to think of the past or what's behind us as a regression. We don't consider like the Isley brothers, something like that, a regression just because in the past it's something that is still needed. And so to that end, the second line, culture as a reservoir of inexhaustible novelty, is unthinkable. And I think that makes a lot of sense in Black music. But I think what we're really, just as an aside, I think what we're really trying to grapple with in Black music is really sort of a century plus of recorded music, and what do we do now that we have so much of our oral culture recorded? So all of this kind of time and creativity is now super compressed, and anyone can kind of pick with it. And so that's something we're going to have to deal with, but that has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. But going back to the Sankofa idea, this sort of circularity or circulatory system in Black music is, it would be there for you to pick it up when you come back to it. I don't know, that kind of makes me think about sometimes line dancing. Coming from Louisiana, I feel like there's so many dances that we all have to learn, sometimes even in gym class and things like that. And it's like, okay, I don't get it now, but you just watch feet, and so by the time the 3rd minute comes around, you got it. And I really enjoy that kind of kind gesture in Black music where it's like, you're not gonna miss anything. This is a much more spatial idea. It's not just kind of like run by you. And I think techno, really more than anything, is such an honest music of like, just tune in, nothing's gonna run by you. But yeah, you really can't talk about much with Black music without talking about the Black church. As you see Sneed here saying, it is placed at the center of the manifestations of repetition in Black culture, and there's about 3 or 4, or actually 5, qualities that I think he highlights that I really wanted to sit with, because once you get into even more abstract notions of blackness where you don't actually hear what's being said, but you see these gestures popping up a lot in black music, even though it gets away from the explicit spiritual text. So the first one is epineplepsis, which is really repeating it's actually a flip, so it's sort of like a yin and yang. So here that says, because his power brings your power, and the Lord is your Lord. So it's sort of this 1-2. It's kind of starting the same way, it ends in the sentence, and that's one form of repetition. There's epistrophe, which is at the end of a phrase. You'll say the same word, so give your life to the Lord, give your faith to the Lord, raise your hands to the Lord, that kind of ending. Making sure there's that emphasis. And then there's the other emphatic repetition, which happens at the beginning of a sentence, which is anaphora. Well, really, you're saying, you're almost making a synonym at the end of every sentence. It's like, how could you do that? That was so terrible of you. That was so unreal of you. That was so, and so a lot of that also happens in the black church. And I just walked over the example. The Lord remaineth the king forever. The Lord shall give the strength to his people, the Lord. So there's the beginning repetition, the emphatic repetition in the beginning. There's also the cut, which the best way I can get into what the cut is would be, and this was what was used in black music. A lot of James Brown used the break. And so in the middle of a sort of presentation or performance, you would kind of cut to a whole nother section, a whole nother kind of energy. And then that would already happen in the more transcendent moments of the black church, predominantly Southern Baptist or Pentecostal, where people would end up speaking in tongues or testifying, and that's kind of delivered in a single pitch where it's just kind of all the way at the top before you come back down. And so something I think about what techno uses in repetition are multiple styles and forms of repetition, but without the message. I think that, actually, let's just continue. So what I was trying to say is that quite often, black religion often has very little to do with the forward-facing aesthetics of the practicing religion. Again, to go back to West Africa, once a lot of West Africans were stolen to America in the Caribbean, they were often kind of forced out, or their religion was sort of assimilated towards whoever was in rule. In New Orleans, it was Catholicism. And so, as probably a lot of you know, there's voodoo or hoodoo that took place in New Orleans and surrounding areas in the American South. And in New Orleans, they were really forced to practice Catholicism. But this sort of African-European reconciliation between this was done heavily in New Orleans. And so one example of this, and a anthropologist, Melville Herskovits, speaks to this, where he calls it a concrete pun, where there will be a forward-facing entity or subject that basically passes code in a very surveilled environment, but really what's going on is the same kind of belief system that you can't really show. And so you'll use the forced upon your religion almost as camouflage to continue to practice, even when you're using the names and characters and the allegories that the forward-facing religion happens. And so one example of that would be St. Patrick and, Legba, where St. Peter, the story in Ireland is that he kind of kicked all the snakes out of Ireland, and he kind of became a saint. But when a lot of the Haitians and West Africans, when they came to New Orleans, they saw the snakes at this saint's feet, and they were like, "Oh, that's Legba," which is imaged in sort of Dehamonian cosmology as son of a snake woman, like a serpent god. And so this is one example of a concrete pun. You're kind of, or it's called a ruse in a way. You're kind of handling people to make sure that they're not basically stopping you from believing in what you're doing. And so I say all that to say that these connections with repetition, as people leave the Black church. A lot of these abstract notions or feelings don't necessarily even begin in the Black church. They kind of began in the West African tradition, but when these customs were kind of imposed upon, they continued to practice without actually saying the same words. A phrase by that would be calling an old god by a new name. And so here's just another sort of example of that. Here in New Orleans, there's this thing called spiritual churches in New Orleans, and so they'll really do contemporary reconciliations or concrete roots. This was back in the 80s, and I'll zoom in a little bit. Here you can see these Native Americans here, and you have St. Mary alongside this Native American called Black Hawk, which in the lore of Mardi Gras Indian tribes in New Orleans, he was considered a sort of watchman who would protect people while they were sleeping or while they were feasting. And so you have all of these, you have Jesus, you have saints, you have Moses, and you have this Native American guy all at the altar. And so, yeah, they're kind of placing these symbols to continue to do a belief system that really feels right in their culture, which really doubles, kind of, if you abstract it all the way back, it ends up just as a sort of, the gestures of religion are the things that continue to withstand through different, through iterations of belief systems. I want to continue because I want to make sure we can get to everything. So now we've arrived at, this is the last part about the whole history thing. It talks about, this is a very racist excerpt from Hegel, a philosopher, where he's talking about African consciousness hasn't reached the contemplation of a fixed objective, where they seem to have a lack of immediacy, where they kind of believe in multiple gods, not in terms like a pagan thing, but the way that nature can be understood as universal. He really saw that as a sort of a lack, when in actuality, again, if you try to get at the idea of a history, it's sort of an impossibility. So again, just as a sort of moment towards how Black culture and Black history and history, I think, function just on two separate wavelengths. So we finally got to Techno, and to continue on the narrative, we're trying to problematize the narrative. This is what was considered to be the first Techno track, Cybotron, with Juan Atkins, who's considered the godfather of Techno, but also here, down up there, you can see 3070. These are the two writers. They got the writing credit. We'll see who 3070 is, but he's also somebody who is outside of the normal history or the narrative of Techno. So, you know, already clear your eyes to that. But let's listen a little bit to Alleys of Your Mind. You hear the percussion, you hear the meter, you hear most if not all. There's no vocals, but there will be vocals later. What we're really hearing in general is a sort of a DIY version of a band where there is sort of, in Detroit Techno, it really starts with a DIY kind of positionality where you can sit in your studio or your bedroom and produce a full track with a sequencer, a drum machine, and maybe a keyboard or two. This is before computers. This one seems, a number of names, Charivari, the song is called Charivari. I'll just start it here because it's going to start in like 10 seconds later. Is what tends to run up against the history, because these came out in the same year, so there'll be some people who say that this was considered to be the first techno song, when really it just feels like it's still getting outside of the disco scene. It was kind of Italio disco. But going back to the kind of idea of concrete puns, which really is just a form of syncretism. Detroit also has its own fair amount of syncretism, where some people would call Detroit techno starting with a kind of Europhile connection, where they were really trying to have this pastiche of being kind of, very bougie or, uppity. We go into these expensive clubs. Techno really started publicly, really as a sober music. It started at a juice bar, a place that didn't have a bar license. When it started being played outside. Initially, it really starts out on the radio, and we're gonna get to that real quick, because it's really, it begins as a radio music, and because it was a radio music, it engaged with so many different genres, so it's a bit of a total genre that takes not just from the black music tradition, but it's in conversation with what was going on in Germany and other places in Europe at the time as well. So there's that. And then this is 3070, also known as Richard Davis. Cybertron used to be a duo by Juan Atkins and Richard Davis after the first record, Clear, which is, a landmark Detroit techno record. They split, but this was in 1978. Allies of Your Mind was 82, 83. And so here you have a history from the person who owned all the gear, who, and again, this is where history gets funny. I'm not in the rooms of either of those people, but Richard Davis would be the one to say that he crafted of the term techno, and it's connected to an economist, Richard Galbraith, connected to technostructure, which was coming out in the 60s, this theory where as technology continues to progress, it'll be those who know how to basically handle and deal with this technology that will be the class that leads us into the future for better or for worse. So I think he was sort of doing a premonition of like Silicon Valley and kind of the tech bro deluge that we would soon be having. And he was kind of trying to address a lot of Detroit, saying that this is where we're headed. We're already getting out of the sort of automation. You have the white flight after the 1968 riots in Detroit, and he was really trying to express people, one, of environmental crisis, but also technological ones. And so from the beginning, whether or not you decide to go the Europhilian route of Charivari, a number of names, or this kind of escapist Alleys of Your Mind, which is trying to kind of transcend above a lot of the plight that was happening in Detroit, an extremely neglected city, and still is. Or you can take the environmental route. This is not just a music full of concepts, but it's a genre that begins through imagination. It's a concept genre. And again, to muddy up the history, I wouldn't even say it begins with Richard Davis. What I would say is that it really begins with this fellow. This is Charles Johnson, also known as the Electrifying Mojo, in 1977, I think into the late 80s. He would have this late night, 2 to 4 a.m., this radio show called, well, he had two, but one was called the Midnight Funk Association. And so people would get different cards, or when he would say that he's dropping the mothership on Detroit, he would ask everybody if they're in a car to honk your horns, or if you're at home to flash your front lights. And from the people that I know that lived in Detroit back then, they would say that, yeah, the whole neighborhood would just start flickering and people would just start honking these horns. And yeah, the radio would really kind of produce this sort of not just an imagined community, but one that was implicit, that we were all together, but not necessarily in a physical space. And I think that it was those ideas, and it was unprogrammed. This was before iHeart and Clear Channel and all of this, where you could really play whatever you wanted. Again, Detroit was a neglected city, and it was through that neglect where a lot of people got to do whatever they wanted to, and one of those people was electrifying mojo. And a huge part of it was also anonymity, which, and you continue into the techno tradition, the anonymity continues to exist, and we'll see that with one person in particular a bit later. But I wanted to also play a little bit from electrifying mojo.
How do you feel about becoming a part of your radio?
It was like 12 o'clock, you know?
First of all, you should know that this is the radio speaking to you, as if you didn't already know. Not that it has not spoken to you before, but maybe never like this. I want you to look at me. I want you to look to the left end of the dial.
Yeah,
Now
really
I want
fun.
you to scan down to the
I wish we could listen to this. And there's so much, and he's actually, Electrifying Mojo is still around, and he does a lot of his broadcasts straight to YouTube, so you should actually check him out. He's still doing his thing. But this kind of World of Worlds, you know, fireside chat kind of sensibility, but thinking about science fiction into it is really a lot of where techno's not just concepts, but kind of gestures of desire really come from. It's almost like the libido of techno, what they want to do, what they want to think about. You know, if someone had to ask me, and I'm no authority, is electrifying mojo. So to continue on to the narrative, these are what's considered the Belleville Three. These are the originators of techno, the main kind of the three horsemen. So there's Juan Atkins, who's in the black shirt, not seated. In the middle is Derek May, and then on the left is Kevin Saunderson, and they're considered the Belleville Three. They're actually in the suburbs of Detroit, and they would, Derek and Juan, the two in the black, when they were kids in high school, they would sit kind of, you know, foot to head to foot at 12 o'clock to 4 and just sit and listen to Electrifying Mojo and think about how these people would make songs and if they can get their songs on the radio. And so when Juan Atkins finally made Alleys of Your Mind with 3070 or Richard Davis, it was Derek that was like sitting outside of like a coffee shop that he heard that Electrifying Mojo comes after his show at 4 o'clock. And so he would sit at, I don't know, it's like a Dunkin' Donuts or something, and he would just kind of sit there, and for 3 weeks nobody came. And then when he finally did come in, the owner of the shop was like, this kid's been waiting for you for like, you know, 2 weeks. You should say something to him. And he handed him Alleys of Your Mind, and that's, you know, really where the ball got rolling. But I really want to talk about this one crew in Detroit called Underground Resistance. The guy on the right is Robert Hood, who was the first employee of Underground Resistance, and the blurred face is Mike Banks, or Mad Mike Banks, one of the co-founders alongside Jeff Mills in Underground Resistance, or UR. And I think, you know, a lot of what Mike speaks to in various interviews, which are few because he also believes in anonymity, is Electrifying Mojo has a huge influence on not just the social ideas, but also a lot of the political ones. There's Jeff in the UR, which we'll talk about him as well and some of his ideas. So a lot of techno seems to be very coded or tries to sit in a kind of camouflage. So back to Jeff and the radio. Jeff actually also did a lot of mixes on the radio, but once you start going to the 90s, people like iHeart and things like that were coming in and say, you really can't play this Public Enemy, this is way too much, you can't play a lot of these political songs. And they were getting worried, Mike and Jeff, about if that stuff gets off the radio, how can this kind of social movement continue when you don't have this kind of public access to these ideas? And so they really tried to continue to do that through their group, Underground Resistance, where some people call them to be super reductive, kind of the techno Public Enemy, but in doing so, techno often is a voiceless medium, and so in many different ways, they try to sort of hint or give advice or suggest towards a lot of their intentions, which they hope that over time will kind of, you know, blend into your own ideas or beliefs with the music. Here's a flyer. No hope, no dreams, no love, my only escape is the underground. Somewhere in Detroit, again, everything feels very opaque, very anonymous. If you're in UR, you have to have a sort of name, you're given a number. It's all very interesting. A huge other point of this kind of suggestion also happens materially, and we'll get into this kind of idea of pedagogy suggestion soon, is they used the actual record, not the liner notes, not the covers quite often. They wouldn't even get a cover, if I can find one. They just get this very stock situation here. But if you have these ideas and you don't have a lot of gear, and it's 1992, which means any samplers, you might get 4 seconds of voice. What can you really say? What can you put into the record? And so a lot of those repetitions that we were talking about, to include the kind of tonality that you might understand with blackness, or like a pentatonic scale or a blues scale, they get away from that after a while, but where can you hint towards these concepts when all you have is this record? There's nowhere to put words other than the label, right? Well, that's not actually true. There's this matrix cut, the lacquer matrix cut, where once you go to the record press, you can be able to kind of write certain things down, and they used this minimal amount of space to try to get to certain ideas. And so there's some even on this one, but I wanted to go through a little bit of these because they really suggest almost a kind of poetic form to me, where similar to like a sonnet, you have, again, this kind of fixed constraint where all you have is this one outer edge here, nothing outside of here, just this one close edge. Well, what can you say? And so on multiple records, each line is one side of a record. So one says, strike from angels unknown, never seen, always there, NSC, that's National Sound Corporation. There was, what was his name? Ron Murphy was the one who was the main one mastering and mixing a lot of these records, so he's kind of like the fifth Beatle of Detroit techno. Or This Has Been a Haunting on black vinyl. Again, they almost remind me of kind of haikus, where you have to write in these sorts of grooves. What can you say with the little amount of space that you have? And so how suggestive can you be to lean into a world that once you put this on the needle, you're still not going to get any sort of explicit or extra information. You kind of, again, have the space to imagine. It kind of provides you all the space to fill in with your own color, your own text, your own words. And I think that's really quite beautiful. So just to continue, I love this one. For the groove readers, underrated and dangerous. So they're really giving a shout out to the people that, maybe like me, that really like to engage with that kind of stuff. You need the hi-hat. Swimmers beware. Come to Detroit, get your ass bit. Like, this is for Piranha. There was an EP called Piranha. So, just these little writings. And then honestly, in a real way, it makes me think of, is it Dave the Potter for Virginia, an enslaved African, like in the 1700s, that was really sort of flaunting that he knew how to read and write. And so on these clay pots, he would make them, but he would also write his name and like a small little poem on them. And he was told, not to and things like that, but he kept doing it, and some of them have been preserved. And I really think of that as a kind of tradition of a self-determined people, making objects of memory that, they want to, almost in a way of flaunting, but it's just to honor. It's like, we can do this. We're gonna show up for ourselves, and I think that's really important. So there's some more here. Transmission, final transmission. I found it. There is existence. I love the misspelling. It's also misspelled on the record. There's existence other than us. I have transformed the tones of the keys to it all. I'll be back. Mad Mike, who is Mike Banks, and that sort of stuff just really makes me smile. This is a link if you're ever interested. They have so many of these. So if you really want to engage in kind of the poetry of underground resistance, I'll be sure to pass this around. But I think the biggest kind of suggestive material that was ever done by UR was X102, which is discovering the rings of Saturn. And so what they ended up doing is, and I'm just going to read this, how long a track, this is from Jeff Mills from 1996, how long a track should be was dictated by how wide the ring actually was on Saturn. So on this record, it was 4 different vinyls, and every single song, which if you've ever seen a record, you see a small space in the groove. So there's 3 tracks on this, and so you can see that through these like moments of some grooves. And what they connected with the length of each track was in the thickness of each one was considered a ring, and the song would be named based off of that ring, which had a particular thickness, and based off of the texture by what they read in the library of each ring. They made sure that the song kind of was in relationship with the ring themselves. It's kind of an unbelievable thing. And so the actual planet Saturn would be this, and then every ring would be every song. And I just really find that to be quite beautiful. And that's what I talked about with the idea of how do you suggest a kind of thing that's bigger than, Sgt. Pepper, which is considered like the first concept record. I mean, this is not 1967. It's like, that was maybe 93 perhaps. But again, for me, I think that this idea is truly the concept record. And I think the conception happens through suggestion. I want to make sure I have enough time. We'll see how far we go. I don't know how much questions we can do, but I'll do my best. Okay. So here's Jeff at Dweller Festival last year alongside Jerome Ellis, who is in orange. Off screen is Benjamin Krusling. Jeff is in the middle. He's got his hand up. Next to him is a poet, Gabrielle Octavia Rucker, and another poet, Sean D. Henry Smith, and I'm off moderating, but he's going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of minimal techno and what he was interested in, what he kind of wanted to share.
Robert and I
Maybe
were making music, and we were having these discussions. I was really interested into architecture at the time, and also art, in particular minimal art. And so I was doing a lot of research, buying a lot of books and things, and so we began to have these conversations about producing music in a way that would allow the DJ to be able to have more freedom, like one would have in a recording studio, to make the tracks very minimal, to make them in a very basic way, so that you could rewrite the structure of the composition, and so we begin to produce just very basic tracks around that time. It was more so for practical reasons. There was no other theory about it other than the fact that the more you listen to it, the more you get pulled into the sequence of it. Once you get pulled into the sequence of it, eventually you're going to forget what you're listening to, because you're so comfortable listening to it that you begin to set yourself free. And that was really the main theory. But it was mostly for practical reasons, for very skillful DJs.
So what he was saying, I love this kind of pulling in and what happens when you set yourself free. Again, to go back to the sort of terms of the emphasis of certain repetitions, is techno uses all of those things within the black church, but a lot of people can listen to techno and be like, this doesn't sound black at all, what are you talking about? But it's really trying to abstract these notions in the same way that, other black expressions almost had to abstract themselves to continue on, especially in the American South. I think about people braiding hair, certain way, escape routes when you're on the plantation, or quilt making, depending on how you would lay a quilt against a fence could tell you which way is north. Just these different vehicles that allowed for camouflage to happen, but a continued communication that for some might read as illegible, but for others, if you're tuned in, then you can hear the communication. And I think that techno is kind of, not the conclusion because, again, it's a circle, but was just the next iteration of something that in a real way is no different than the blues or jazz. The best person that I think can at least try to give a definition of techno is this, Mike Banks, again, the other half of Underground Resistance. I do not view techno as music of the future. I think it's a device that we can use to think about it, and if we think about it, we might want to materialize those ideas. I talked a little bit about the blues. I'm not going to say all of this, but what I really wanted to say up here is an epistemology, or in a way of knowing. There is a Clyde Woods, who was a Black studies scholar, I think went to UC Berkeley, or that he was a professor at UC Berkeley, came up with this term, blues epistemology. And here it's a self-referential, ethno-regional series of explanation that informs their daily life, organizational activity, culture, religion, and social movements. And here at the bottom, the blues, both as an aesthetic and a way to produce and share embodied knowledges about the lived environment Southern Blacks found themselves within, allowed for the song-centered oral practices in African cultures to continue under rapidly increasing conditions of intense censorship, violence, and surveillance. The blues became another methodological form of resistance. And so, yeah, the same way that blues was satire, the same way that blues was trying to speak truth to power, or just your own sense of expression because you're feeling down or depressed because you're going through all these situations. Techno is literally no different. Detroit was not a great place to live for Black people, at least in terms of the kind of thriving or the abundance that we try to think about. And so a lot of that came out in the music, but because of the situations, they weren't lugging around guitars. A lot of them either started in gospel or even in funk, but when you could consolidate and use technology to really have a fuller sound, they just went for it naturally. Okay, so I want to do my little last part here, hopefully, because I feel like I'm talking about the suggestion and what it can teach you, and if the music can give you spaces to think for yourself, I want to talk about the things I've thought for myself. So just quickly, I want to talk about prosody, which is sort of the theory around stress and intonations in language or sometimes in poems. And there are these three versions before you get to speech or whatever you're trying to create. And so there's a linguistic, there's paralinguistic, and non-linguistic. And so what I'm trying to superimpose on top of those three in the first column are different kinds of Black music over time. And so the first one would be blues, the second one can be jazz, and the third one can be techno. And so with the blues or even gospel, the rules of grammar first apply because you're using language, so you have to think about what you're going to say. Or not, sometimes you can go into the paralinguistic and just get into speaking in tongues, but we're not there just yet. So you have the utterance, which are the rules, how am I singing this? What is this going to sound like? And then you have the motor and command of generation. What are the physiological constraints of your vocal cords and things like that? How much breath control? And then there's the production of that actual speech once it gets sounded out. And then, that's just a through line. You're just creating a song with voice and instruments. And then you're just doing voice, although there's vocal jazz. But for the paralinguistic, you can kind of begin a nonlinearity where you can sort of address the utterance before the planning, hence improvisation. But you're still held by physical constraints of motor command. What are you going to do with your body? What's stopping you before sound is produced? And I think that the idea of technology, or an automated technology, or an electrified or amplified technology, is what techno deals with in the non-linguistic. And I think because Black music generally was such an oral culture, I think we have to start to think about oral in almost two different ways, not just the O-R-A-L, but the A-U-R-A-L, like the kind of like how are we listening and what kind of engagement can we find ourselves within. And so techno deals with the non-linguistic, which means you can skip planning. I know Adrexia is a really big name in Detroit techno, and a lot of their music was just press record, we're going to figure this out, this isn't even synthesized. So there's a lot of improvisation that happens in techno music, or you can skip that and go into a motor command if you want to apply your voice, or you can go right to sound production because you can press a certain thing, or some things you don't have to even press anymore. Things can just happen if you press record and deal with modular synths that begin to talk with each other. And so I just really like this idea of trying to find techno within the black music tradition, because I think because it really wasn't accepted in the way that other genres were, it's not really kind of brought into the fold. But I think it deserves a place, and that goes back to Dweller in general. Okay, real quick, because I like to talk about the things that I thought about, not the ones that I'm just referencing, is this parse tree. And this is really generative grammar. So I try to think about techno as a kind of linguistic program. And so just briefly, there's subject, noun, and then the verb phrase. But within the verb phrase is the verb and the noun, and there's the determinant and the noun. So basically, it's how you construct a sentence. And I think that techno also is a sort of logic system that allows you to produce your own infinite amount of sentences or songs through a pretty tight parameter. And so I try to think about techno as a form of generative grammar. And I would much rather read, 'cause I know there's some people that, I just want to say a bunch of stuff, so I'm just going to read this that I wrote. Generative grammar, a way to think about the difference between pop music structure and progressive music structure. Also techno, before it had the name techno, was just progressive music. So the definition is basically, for generative grammar, a way to see a language as a structure of logical rules set up in a way where you can make an infinite amount of different sentences. For pop, it's not very interested in producing an infinite amount of different expressions. It's cool with replicating itself over and over again, like how so many pop songs use the same chord structure. This has also helped me see techno as a modern strategy for people creating a logic to better help each other speak for ourselves, a format to help you find your own sound or voice. In that way, it has infinite possibilities, not too different from poetry, honestly, or the blues. Techno is the music you get if you counted forever. So this is what forever might look like in a generative grammar, where you can continue on a sentence as long as you continue to abide by certain rules. Songs can get as expansive or kaleidoscopic as need be, but within not necessarily certain parameters, but the way genres work in general, that there are these sort of vague, implicit parameters that I think techno sometimes abides by. Okay, the last thing here is something that I'm really going to try to take a swing at. So this is a differential geometry act happening called holomeny. And so what holomeny is in non-Euclidean space, because we're dealing with spheres, if you rotate along a vector of a certain shape, it doesn't have to be a triangle, is that your orientation will change as you rotate. Whereas if you were rotating in a 2D space, you're going to continue to look out the same way that you began, but that does not happen in non-Euclidean space. A way to think about this is to use your thumb and then do something similar to this, where you would start with your thumb up, so this is the vector, and then you would go this way, and then you would go this way, and then you would go this way. And so you're back where you started, but you're in a different orientation. And I'll tell you how I thought about this and what I think it might connect to go back to West Africa and to get back to Detroit. And I'm not going to read all this, but again, for posterity, I didn't just want to say this and not have it here. So parallel transport is in differential geometry when a line is going around a shape like it's a triangle. In normal Euclidean geometry, it's in the same direction it started from, but in non-Euclidean geometry, it results in a different orientation on the sphere from where you start at, which is to say, which I'm right here, you're back where you started at, but you're looking in a different direction from the one you began with, which to me sounds like what we were talking about with African music, where you pick it up where you can. So another way of thinking about this is the fact that any pair of straight lines on a sphere will always converge in the way that latitude and longitude lines actually don't, or if they do converge, they converge at the top. So like, even though you're parallel, again, linearity can't actually take place in a sphere. They're always going to kind of collide in a certain way. How I'm connecting this with James Nee's on repetition is to think about how cultural, retentive, or the repetitive nature of Black music is progression without thinking about linearity. And so I'll just say this last part. In physical space, I relate Black life to have undergone the similar pressures or stresses as earth and material does. such as compression, extraction, folding, manipulation, fracturing, refining, etc. And these pressures can be understood as a series of functions or expressions onto a being. Arithmetic or math allows one to make sense of these things in relation to each other in a way before a connotative value derived language is applied. So I'm not making a value judgment on it. Can we use math to quietly, that is, without explicit use of cultural ornamentation, which I think Techno does, articulate our own relationship to the earth and each other the same way we might allow math to sequence our basic understanding of the earth itself? What I'm saying there is just that we are looking at nature, and in a way nature isn't looking at us, but it's sort of, we're replicating similar patterns where if you're in the American South, colonialism, I think, is dealing, the land is dealing with the same kind of oppression systems, again, extraction, manipulation, compression, reduction, mishandling. And so I think a lot of this music tends to be in conversation with the environment around it. And so what I think this repetition does, the circulation does, what Halomany is doing is sort of giving another dimension to the sort of cosmology that happens in West Africa. This is from the Congo, where as you kind of go in a circle, and this is also why, if you've ever heard of a ring shout, which are what a kind of religious practice that a lot of people in the American South, a lot of black people in the American South would do. They would also go counterclockwise. It was connected to this cosmology of the exchange of symbolic journeys through dance music, where you would go between the physical world and the spirit world the longer that you kind of went into these circles. And so lastly, I don't know how much time we'll have for this, but I wanted to end with another sort of North Star. It began with Anthony Braxton, but I wanted to have these kind of active listening questions up while we listen to a little bit of music. I brought some records because, again, a lot of techno is a material culture. These are like people trying to sell records and make their lives and make their livelihoods. And so I wanted to actually have that physically here. But while we're doing that, I wanted to kind of share a sort of active listening campaign, which I don't know if we'll have the time for. Yeah, okay. So we'll start with that. I think that should be it. Yeah. Okay. Right, so here you have I'm not going to talk like this, but I just wanted to say that this idea of repetition, you're already hearing call and response, but similar to the cosmogram, you have this circulatory system within the music, but the more you circulate, the more it sort of legitimizes itself. And so just because the song is over and you said the same things in the same sort of ways or different kind of repetitions, you've ended up somewhere else. You might have freed yourself internally, or you transcended in a kind of way. And again, it's that kind of spirituality that is beyond voice, but in my opinion, is kind of, that transcendence is in the act and the gesture of these West African traditions or customs that find themselves in black music today. So one of these, I don't think this needle made it all the way up to Boston. So we're just gonna hear a little bit just so we can get to the next track. I wish I could really do a proper mix for y'all, but maybe next time. Yeah, let's just do that. Maybe we could, just while I just play some records, we can do a Q&A. Because I know we only have so much time. Yeah, why not? I'm not mixing anymore, so there's no concentration for me. Yeah. No problem. Yeah.
Wow. This was incredible, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us. One round of applause while we have this moment.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So, those in the audience, we would love to hear your questions. Please raise your hand if you'd like to share a question. I'll kick us off.
Yeah.
This is actually kind of neat to ask a question while the record's going, honestly.
Okay. Yeah.
I wonder if we can start with like a very simple question, which is Techno Southern?
I think the world is Southern at this point. Its roots are in the South, but then this goes back to trying to find an origin point. You know, it's a sort of impossibility. So I would say that it is, but then you can continue to go back into the Caribbean, or again, you can go back into West Africa. So there's this idea that, how do I say this? The mathematical term for origin is a convenient point of reference. So, you know, whatever you need to find your center. So for me, yes, but also no. Yeah.
We might start somewhere, end up in the same place, but in a different orientation, as you showed us.
Exactly.
So this is a question from online. Yvette asks, can you tell us more about the difference between the circular aspect of repetition in Black culture compared to the more quote-unquote end goal, or as we would say in the historical profession, teleological focus of European philosophers like Hegel?
Yeah, again, they were interested in the fixed point, and I think something that helps me think about or to visualize this idea comes from an amazing writer, John Berger, from this old BBC program that he did. It was 4 episodes long, called Ways of Seeing, and it was in Ways of Seeing where he talked about how the one-point perspective in a lot of kind of Renaissance paintings and the oil painting tradition is actually centered around subjecthood that happens outside of the frame. So the subject is actually the person who's looking at the painting, and so that's because, I don't know why they were so obsessed, maybe still obsessed with private property, where what you're looking at could be yours, and the tangibility of oil painting suggests a kind of materiality that you can possess by buying the painting. And so I don't know where fixed point objecthood comes from, but it is a part of the Western tradition, and I think that why it's sort of rubbing up against a lot of Western music, against African music or non-Western music, is that there is no one perspective. You can look at African art in the way that Picasso went down and looked at African art and saw that they were painting on one, canvas or whatever from multiple positions, and that was something that kind of blew his mind. So that's where you get, Cubism and things like that. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm not sure if we have any questions in the audience. If anyone wants to raise their hand to ask. We have one in the front here, one in the middle, second row. So wait a second while Ebony brings the mic to you. While we get that mic down, I was very intrigued by underground resistance trying to mimic the rings of Saturn.
Yeah.
And it seems like astronomy is a very strong theme in techno. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the inspiration that astronomy brings to the field of making electronic dance music?
Yeah, again, I think it doesn't begin in techno. You can look at a lot of influences that they were into, like Funkadelic and the Mothership Connection, and everything's kind of far out, it's outer space. And then it's just the conditions of what's going on at the time. You're just a couple of decades away from the space race, and the idea of outer space was still such kind of a profound thing. I was reading this one interview from, I think it was Mike Banks, he was talking about when he first saw the idea of robots when he was growing up in the 60s. He was watching on the TV, and he was just like, I can't even fathom what that might feel like to really be confronted with this idea of, I guess if you're Black, you're kind of considered othered, and to kind of see that otherness happen, but in a different sort of perspective, is kind of mind-blowing. And so, again, coming from radio and this kind of sci-fi thing, they're also really into comic books, You know, a lot of this is a very kind of suburban tradition amongst black men and women, just black people in general. So there's a lot of things that probably aren't as cool in the way that we think about coolness now, but space was just a cool thing back then in the way that I think it kind of isn't now, but yeah. No diss to all my astronomers.
Right, shout out to the astronomers.
Yeah.
So let's take our first question in the front row. We actually have our student, Chloe, who's going to ask the first question.
Thank you so much for this whole lecture. It's been really interesting.
Yeah.
I was thinking a little bit about something that you said at the beginning of music. One of the tenets of music being like body motion,
Yeah.
in connection to the sound. And I think the work you do with Dweller is really interesting. And so I wanted to think about pedagogy and its place in techno music. So especially with like the lecture series in conjunction with like parties and stuff like that. How would you say, like, how would you suggest we can teach, techno music, not techno, but how do we teach listening and feeling and, this lived experience that goes into the creation of the music? That was really complicated.
Yeah, teach is a huge word. Because I feel like all you can kind of do is share, and if your ears or your heart is open enough to it, can you receive it? I think quite often that can't be the responsibility of the teacher. All they can try to do is produce spaces for the possibility of a moment of transcendence, which is also just learning in general, So I think that any space that can allow for a sort of coming together is really important. And I think that, again, to go back to black music, before anything else, it's a tradition of an organizing structure. It brings people together. Again, living in New Orleans, when you hear like a second line going down the street, at minimum, you're gonna look outside or like get on the balcony or the porch and be like, what's going on? Most often not, you're gonna go out and join, and that doesn't happen without the music. When I was a kid, I used to think about like, I was just sitting in church and I would say like, what would be happening here without the music? Like how close could we be? Like where is God in this? And I feel like music has shown itself to play a role in that, if not be that. I don't know if you know this Music Soul Child song called Love. It's a great song. But he initially wrote the song as a gospel song. He was saying God instead of love. But there's really, in his mind, and in many people's minds, there's no difference. So I think the way that we talk about black abstract or black abstraction is really just what we do. It's just something that we do across time. And so I think as long as you just produce the conditions of coming together, then I think people might be perceptive to it. Listen more, I have to say listen more. Yeah.
We have another question in the crowd.
Hi, my name's Xavier. I'm a PhD student in music as well. And I was curious to know, like, what do you think it was about the pandemic that brought your interest in music to come to the forefront?
I mean, I'd always loved music. I think I almost felt like a voyeur of the whole electronic scene. I was really into electronic music as a kid, from my brother listening to a lot of that music. Even before that, I was into like Stone's Throw as a kid. Jay Dilla, again, my brother would be putting me on, and what they were listening to and their samples. And so it was just where I found myself thinking a lot of the time in my off time. And so when the pandemic hit and just kind of sitting around, what do I find myself thinking about? But what I'm forced to do is to, I was a PhD student as well, but in geology, and I was like, on these Zoom courses and things like that. But this was in March when all that happened, where in February I went to Dweller with no connection. I didn't know anybody there, I just wanted to go. I'm in Louisiana, I'd fly up to Brooklyn, I'm just like, I want to be a part of this. So I was already the editor for like a month, thinking I wouldn't be a lot. But then when no one was in the house, or everyone was in the house, we just dedicated all of our time to that blog. And over time, I was like, this is saving me right now. If the world would ever open back up, back in 2020, that's what I was thinking. I was like, I wouldn't want to leave this. And so I made a really, really scary decision. And I left kind of the science field for ethnomusicology. So yeah, it just felt right. I felt cornered, like an existential corner, I think, yeah.
I'm really glad you made the switch because you're bringing that expertise into this field and it's making some really novel connections. So thank you for your bravery.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about the electrifying mojo.
Yeah.
I love that part of your talk, and I was so curious, considering his investment in anonymity, how does that jive with the needs of promoting and marketing a show? What kind of scene showed up at those shows?
Yeah.
He was a sort of fan favorite in our online chat, and someone noted that black and white Detroiters would show up to these shows. So I don't know if you can give us a little bit more gloss on that history.
Sure. Well, anonymity in general, I think, was also not inherent to the architecture of club spaces back then, where people like Frankie Knuckles in Chicago, or Ron Hardy, or Larry Levin in like the Paradise Garage, or in the Loft. It was called the Loft because the DJ was up here, and everyone was sort of down on the floor, and very few people were kind of looking up at these people. So the anonymity, again, if you start from radio, there is no visual component to it, and I think it kind of continued to lead on. And that's not to say no one knew people's faces. I think Mike, for a long time, was the one who was super strict on like bandana wherever I go, mask if I'm going to Europe, and it was only like in 2006 where he was like, okay, I'll show my face. But that was like 20 years where he was just arm's length to everybody. Yeah, I think if you're trying to have this idea of it's not me, it's the music, then you have to make kind of intentional, and to some people, a sacrifice of like, it's not about me. And I think to the best, we try to continue that with Dweller. It's not very, it tries not to be like representational or something that deals with figuration. We try to keep that abstract notion of like, how can you think about what's happening? How do you think about ideas? How do you imagine? Yeah.
Right. And I think even aesthetically, I mean, we studied Mondre's album, and to think of Daft Punk getting their inspiration of wearing sort of masks from that album is really interesting too, like how anonymity becomes in a sense a brand or sort of a aesthetic feature of techno.
Yeah, our power, it's a tool.
Yeah, so we have another question in the audience, Allure, the introducer for our prior talk.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
The question that I had was, something that you brought up was the spaces that folks were making music in, like in their bedrooms or like those sorts of spaces. And I'm really interested in space and identity, especially as somebody who has made, I think, all of my music in my room. And we've been learning about a lot of people who have been making music like in spaces like outside of the studio, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether or not that changes that adds something to the nature of the music being made.
I mean, I almost want to ask you that, but
Hey.
As a musician, do you feel like you're more comfortable when you're making music in your own room, or?
Well, I am self-taught.
Okay.
So I've never really been in a studio.
Yeah.
But now that I know how to make music in my room, I don't have the want to be in the studio as much as I used to, because I realized that it wasn't necessarily necessary to create good pieces of art. In the way that I feel like some folks like ascribe like that space as like a necessary thing to be like to create like good or finished quote unquote work. So, and then I learned that the people around me that I like valued their work weren't always doing it in that space either. So while I'm like interested in learning how to do it there, I don't think that it's a necessary thing. So I think that it just changes like the value system like that I think about when I think about like the art that I'm listening to, or like I notice when people are ascribing like value to art based off of where it's been created.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, we can't get into their heads, but I think what I really appreciate for techno is that it just gives you, it's a generous thing. You know, you can do that, whereas before it was an impossibility to do recorded music outside of a studio. So to go home and get cheap gear that now costs $700, you know, back then, Roland 808s and those drum machines were like, you know, bargain bin stuff. But they really added their own kind of value to it. So it's good that it's an option, you know. Yeah.
So we have a question. If anyone else in the audience has a question, please raise your hand. But we have a question online from Jennifer who asks, in Detroit techno, do you also hear the repetition of the machines and the assembly plants? And I guess a question I would add to that is, you know, is techno in that sense sort of a working class music?
Yeah, in the same way that the blues was working class music. You would often hear so much about trains and just this sort of repetition would also lend itself to labor practices. A lot of call and response was used, didn't begin, but it was used, you know, to contribute to making sure that you can get the work done. This goes back to the whole narrative thing that I find myself troubling with. The idea of techno, the first major release was coming out of a UK label, and the one, like the A&R was named Neil Rushton, and he came to Detroit and kind of talked all about it. So I know there are some people that talk about the automation. I think it's fair and appropriate to say that that was what was going around them, and so a lot of the people that lived in Detroit, a lot of their fathers at the time went to these places and worked in car factories. So yeah, trying to find yourself within the machine and the rhythm of the machine that kind of hurts circulation, I think is it's definitely important to gesture at, but I have trouble with it, so that's kind of why I didn't talk about it, but that's okay. Yeah.
So much more to say.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much. Join me in one last round of applause for Ryan C. Clarke. Thank you everyone online for joining us for our second lecture series, and we hope that you join us for our third, fourth, and fifth. Please check out our YouTube channel and click the notifications icon for a reminder. Have a good evening.